Okay, well, thank you. This is great. I know there's been a lot of questions about standard-based IEPs, so when Adam talked to me about doing this, I'm happy to share what I know, and hopefully will mesh with what you've been told in the past, or at least what will be correct. So the big move in the past few years has been to standards-based IEPs. So the IEP by law is supposed to be developed to meet the child's needs, to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. So that's the basis of all IEPs, is we have our eyes on that gen ed piece, and we are looking at how do we get the child to be able to make progress and meaningfully participate in the gen ed curriculum. And our IEP is designed to help be able to get us to that end goal. So when Adam and I talked, we talked about focusing mostly on PLAFs and on goals on the IEPs, because there were questions about what that could and should look like. So I'm just going to pull out those pieces of the IEP and talk about them today. If there are other pieces that you have questions about, we can absolutely come back together and address those later. So the PLAF in a standard-based IEP kind of addresses this piece of, hey, here's where the child is, here's what they know how to do, here's what they're able to do, and here's the standard over here, and then there's this gap in between. So between what they can do and what we want them to be able to do is this gap, and that's where that IEP goal fits in, is how are we going to bridge this gap? How are we going to get them from point A, where they're at, to point B, where they are essentially with their typical peers. So the PLAF includes these things. There should be a reference to the Utah Core Standard. It will include the student strengths that are data-based with a can and a can't do. Then there will be a student need statement. We're going to talk just a little bit about a gap analysis that helps us be able to do that. And then there's an impact statement. So if you have those 5 things embedded in a PLAF, that would be a compliant, standard-based PLAF for an IEP. So let's break apart each of those 5 things. And yeah.
Are you going to send this out to, could you send this with me and I could share it with everybody, or is this?
Yep, absolutely.
Like Karen Harrop, can't copy, can't share kind of thing?
Yes, and it won't have my name on it anywhere, just in case my disclaimer holds true that, you know, maybe Karen Harrop doesn't know what she's talking about. So very good. Yeah, no problem. I'll forward it on. So let's break out those 5 pieces. Is everybody familiar with how to access the core standards? I'm going to go with a yes. I really can't see if people are nodding heads or saying yes, but I'm going to make the assumption that we know how to reference the core standards in math, ELA, science. One of the things when we're looking at those core standards, there are, in any given grade level, in any given area of core standards, multiple standards that regular education will be covering during the course of a year. One of the things we have done is, because we know some of our students, obviously all those standards, we're not going to make it from A to Z with those standards. One of the things we've done as a district is identify those key lever standards that we're going to default to, that we feel like a child needs to know in order to, number one, be able to access the gen ed, but also those standards build on each other. They're foundational for a lot of them. So if some standards are a key piece of foundation, that meaning that next year, if you don't know this, then the standard they teach the next year, you're not going to be able to do that. And then the standard the next year after, you're not going to be able to do that. We're looking for those key foundational standards, those high leverage standards that maybe we will focus more on and consider those a priority when we're looking at the standards in general. Yeah.
Question. So do we find the standard that fits our student and start there?
That may be a possibility. I would think in most cases that would be difficult because the standard probably won't fit the student. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, if we're looking through the standards in ELA, for example, and we're trying to find a standard that the child can do or fits their abilities, that may be difficult, I would imagine, in 99% of our cases, because our kids aren't working at standards levels yet. So what we do is we look at those key standards, which are the standards they really need to be able to do. So maybe they're priority 1, 2, and 3, and look at those. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Like a reading foundation skill for a first grader.
So I teach high school, but my students are at the first grade level. So do I go to the first grade core?
I see what you're saying. No. Nope, you will still use the grade-based standard. Okay, so, and I know you're going to go, but there's no way, let me read your mind here, but there's no way they can do that grade-based standard, right? So I'm hoping as we go through this, it will make sense as to why we still stick with the grade-based standard. So if your kiddo is 10th grade, we're going to use 10th grade ELA standards in the PLAF.
Karen,
Right.
For those in the outreach, if they're not really necessarily working on core standards in their IEP goals, would a hearing or listening goal or language goal be appropriate to substitute for a core standard?
Depends. And if they're going in as a related service, the purpose of a related service is to help a child access or make progress in their special ed service. So it could be very appropriate for that related service goal to be linked to the special ed service goal. So for example, if I have a student who's working on reading fluently with comprehension on a fifth grade level, and that's my SPED service, then the related service goal of a deaf educator might be working on understanding idioms, working on understanding double meanings, whatever that might be, in order to help that special ed service goal of reading make the child make progress in it. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank
So it's
So as a related service, it may not be necessary to reference a standard. You may be referencing a SPED service goal. Okay, so first we're going to peruse those standards, pick out the standards that are high leverage standards for our students to be working on. Okay, so then we're going to look at present levels. Where is the student right now? We know what the goal is, or the goal, not the IEP goal, but the end goal for a student is to access that standard. Where is the student right now? So let's take that scenario of the student's in 10th grade. The 10th grade ELA goal says we'll write a argumentative essay with 5 paragraphs, topic, sentence, transition pieces, yada, 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 okay? And then we say this child is able to write complete sentences based on fact with capital at the beginning of the sentence and a period at the end, okay? That might be what the student is able to do right now. In the PLAF, we would write it something like this. It's always baseline data. It's always data-based, always. The source of the data is included in that PLAF statement. And the data is usually always numeric. So if we're not using numbers in our data, we got to think about, is that really data, or is that maybe just more opinion or preference that we've placed in there? And then it identifies what the student is able to do. So in the scenario of the 10th grade student, maybe on the first grade level, we would say Johnny is able to read at a rate of 50 words per minute on a first grade level reading passage with 80% accuracy, okay? Or if it's a different kind of a skill, is able to, I'm trying to think on a more functional skills level, something you might do is able to recite name, address, and phone number correctly in 3 out of 4 prompts for that information, okay? So one of the things I want to put here on this CAN statement that Adam and I talked about, that baseline data, when we write it, it usually has the source of the data in it. So it usually has a number of what the data is representing. However, standardized testing data may not be your best bet right here. Okay, so if we're saying a child scored a 57 on the reading fluency portion of the Woodcock-Johnson, that probably, I'm not going to say never, but that probably will not tell me what the child can actually do, right? What is the skill they can actually do? Can they read fluently? Is it an accuracy issue? I can't break down as to what the child can do with a task. So the curriculum-based data, the observational type data is probably our better bet there. Does anybody have any concerns about what data would go in that, or questions about what data would go in that PLAF statement of the cans, just the can portion of that statement?
So
I think we're missing a mic somewhere.
I think we have a question here.
So something I always heard was taught about writing goals is that you aren't meant to use able to. So if I say my student is able to blah, 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 whatever, I've always been taught you don't write that in true, false.
So this is a PLAF, not a goal.
Yes.
Right? But
So
so even for a class, they say, just say this student reads blah, 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 and then you put your numbers in. This student writes
The can.
right. So it's
That's
the
the
can part, but you just use a verb and don't write that they're able to, just because able to is vague. I don't know
Well,
if that
That's
was just
That in
something
the
I was always
details.
taught, is that it's too vague for us to say they're able to, because able means that I'm capable of how much, which is where the numbers are so necessary.
I think if you have the numbers in there, I think you're hitting the can piece. I think that's a preference thing, quite honestly. If you were to write, Johnny is able to read, you know, a first grade passage at 50 words per minute with 80% accuracy, that to me is sixes to Johnny reads a first grade passage at 50 words per minute. If you were able to say Johnny's able to read a passage, then maybe that would kick in. But I don't see the difference there, but maybe that's just a personal preference on that.
I'm sure the data is in.
Right, it's got to be data based.
On that, I do feel like when we say is able to, I mean, maybe we're getting nitpicky here, but I think that that's where we're lacking in our goals to begin with, is the detail. I think that in some of our circumstances, maybe we have a child who is able to, under certain circumstances, do this task, where if we say can do this, it's a little more definitive, like this is an established skill, as opposed to sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, depending on whether they want to or not.
So maybe that's where we can write in the degree of to where they're going to, so, you know,
Yeah.
so he'll read, you know, 80 words per minute, this many trials, with a degree of difficulty.
Okay, so I'm going to bring us back to this isn't a goal, this is the PLAF.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we're jumping ahead to constructing a goal right there, and we're not there yet.
So Karen, let me back to this question of the can and the PLAF. This is not a place that I would use. I would use data from a standardized test to determine what the student can and can't do. I would need to use formative assessments. I would need to do observations and say this is so and so is able to do these things, but not according to the standard scores that I'm getting from the ROW or the EOW or the Woodcock-Johnson, that kind of thing.
What
And
about CASELs in this point? Are you familiar with them, and could you put that information in here, like the student can perform the tasks in, you know, each category in the age range, or no? Are you familiar with, I want to like an example of how you would plug where they're at in the CASELs into that.
Okay, so if I were to take a sub-test score, which on the CASEL, if I were to do that, so I hear you saying, you know, like functional daily living skills, right? And I would say the child is able to perform 90% of the skills in the CASEL. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, there's the CASEL assessment, and then there's the CASEL's checklist. It's like it's a standard-based battery of things that kids can and can't do.
And I guess I was thinking of Castle's checklist, but it does give like a skill level, and then you can say 90% at that age grade. I guess I was familiar with that and how it could be plugged into this and be considered data or data.
So I think you could, Joni. I think this would be an appropriate place for you to use the Castle standards will fit well into this, and they're not standardized. This is a basically stepping stones, milestones of where the child is at. So I think those would actually work here. And it's not the Castle's assessment, it's the Castle standards.
Okay, so I'm just going to add to that piece, Adam. If you were to construct the data in the PLAF that said Johnny is able to do 90% of the skills outlined in the subtest, yada, yada, on the Castles, then I don't believe that is a can statement in a PLAF. If I were to pick out the dominant skills in there saying, according to the Castle, Johnny is able to, and then I'm going to write those specific skills there, is able to, and do you want to hand me some of the skills that might be in one of those subtests?
Can you throw out some,
Identify four critical elements.
identify 4 critical elements out of a group of many. I'm just restating what's being
Okay. Right, that to me, when given 4 different, or given 10 objects, Johnny is able to identify 4 of the objects in sign or voice, you know, whatever. That's more specific, but I don't think you could write, can do 90% of the skills outlined in subtest A on the Castle. Does that make sense? That's where I think you were kind of asking, Joni, right?
And it relates to the goal. And I think that's the part where we're considering where we're going with the needs and the goal is probably in our thought process here, because all of those skills in that subtest don't necessarily pertain to where we're going with this particular need or goal in this section. So we're sorry that we have a different frame of reference we're all thinking about right now, but I think where you're going makes sense.
Okay, and maybe let's take that when we get to how we're going to line it to the goal. That might make sense. So knowing, in order just to go through this plat bit, knowing that that can statement has to be data-based. The source of the data has to be included. The data is numeric and identifies what the student is able to do. Okay. Now, the other piece that's going to come in that is the can't piece of that. And we don't necessarily have to say can't do this. We can state it in a more positive way, but we are going to say what the student struggles to do. And that's also going to include additional baseline data. So taking that Castle example, based on the Castle given on June 10th, 2018, Johnny can name so many whatever, right? However, when asked to name proper nouns, Johnny struggled to produce yada yada. Okay, now I'm making things up out of my area of expertise, obviously, so don't laugh at what I'm like plugging in there, but I'm just trying to illustrate that piece. So if I were to put it in the arena of academics, I may say, according to Dibble's assessment given on June 10th, 2018, Johnny was able to name A through M in the alphabet in lower and uppercase. He struggled to correctly name N through Z in lower and uppercase. Does that make sense? Because where that's going now is here's what he can do, here's what he can't do. And so we have a clear picture of that child's abilities in that reading piece, which is aligning back to that standard. And we can say, here's where the student is now, but here's where it's expected at grade level, and we're creating that gap analysis between the standard and what they can do, okay? Gap analysis is a whole nother discussion. I don't know if you're familiar with doing gap analysis, but basically we're going to be looking at what are the precursor skills that we need to work on that will take us one step further from where the student's at towards that core standard. Okay? Does that make sense?
Are we gonna talk about that at all? Because
What
I feel
the
like
dot
that's.
is.
Oh,
That's what the dot is, yeah.
Like gap analysis.
DOT, it's
How do you know
an
that? I thought
assessment.
you didn't know anything.
In preschool?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of the measurement tool, right, for the standards in preschool.
Correct.
So that's when we can sit down and say, okay, here's where we're at. We got a good picture based on our data where we're at with this student. We know where we would like him to be. What is the prerequisite skills we have to teach to close that gap between where they're at and where the standard is? And that may look like this. In order to progress in the general ed curriculum, make progress towards the standard, Johnny needs to be able to verbally identify letters M through Z when presented and their associated sounds to make progress in the general ed curriculum, right? Okay, so that's that needs statement. In order to progress, in order to make progress towards that standard, he needs to be able to do this. Now, one of you mentioned before, that all has to align to that goal, right? This is exactly where I'm going to make that statement right there that's going to help us draw out, this is what he needs to know, therefore this is what we need to teach, and the goal is the prescription of what we're going to teach. Okay, are we all good so far on these pieces?
Can I just clarify one thing on that one? We see this in our related servers and outreach because we are supporting the special education curriculum, right? As you already said, that we're working toward that. So just in that statement there, we would be saying in order to progress in the special education curriculum.
So that our related servers do write, yes, we train them to write like that. So we're making a direct link back to this service is needed as a related service because in order to do that special ed service piece, they have to be able to do this related service piece, right?
So as a related server and outreach teacher, you typically will not be putting in your class general curriculum reference.
So some of our SLPs do write core standards, that there are listening and spoken language standards under the ELA categories in most grades. And some of our SLPs as related services will write their goal aligned to that standard.
Yeah,
and
so they use that standard, but do they refer specifically that they're trying to help access the general curriculum or?
Yep, some of them do.
I guess just.
So if you're a related server, that may not be your best piece, but if you're the primary server, so you have a student who's hearing impaired and you're the primary server, then you will link back in a lot of cases to those standards. Okay, did I answer that?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Okay, the last part of the PLAF, the fifth portion, is that impact statement. How does the disability affect performance in the general education curriculum? So this statement helps the team to consider how the disability affects progress in learning those grade level content standards. So this is kind of a what it doesn't look like example. We don't use the student's exceptionality to explain how the disability affects the involvement or progress in the gen ed curriculum. So we don't write Johnny's learning disability or Johnny's hearing impairment affects his progress in the general curriculum. What we want to really get down and say is how does that happen? Johnny's weaknesses in applying organizational strategies in writing, such as forming an argument and supporting with clear reasons, affects his progress in completing 6th grade essay assignments. So what we're looking at is what is the impact of this disability across the board? And one of the nice things about this is I see a lot of students where the manifestation of their disability is addressed in the IEP goal. It's addressed with direct services, but a lot of our students access more than just special education services across the day. So this is an opportunity for us to really think about, okay, if he has a hearing impairment, what does that mean for 6th grade geography when he goes in there? What does that mean for 6th grade science when he goes in there? The other portions of his day other than when he's with us as special educators. bringing it back to a learning disability, it's great if we're working on reading in special education's class time to try and bridge that gap. But when he walks out of our class and goes back to science, if he's reading on a first grade level, I know he can't access the text in there. So this is going to make the team think about, what do we need to do in addition to that goal of trying to close the gap to help that child be successful across the day? So that might lead to accommodations, modifications. Needs the sixth grade science text read to him, or he needs to partner read with the geography text when he goes back to geography class, because this disability is going to impact more than just the time he spends with me and my special education services. So it may look like this. Johnny's weakness in the area of reading comprehension impacts his or her ability to access information from grade level text when in the gen ed curriculum. Okay, so that's that fifth part of the PLAF statement. So let's try and put all of this together in one PLAF that merges those 5 key pieces and see what it might look like. So I've kind of color coded here according to the slides, each piece of this PLAF as an example of the distinct 5 key pieces of a PLAF. So it could look like this. The 6th grade core standards require 6th grade students write arguments to support claims with clear reasons and relevant evidence. Writing arguments requires strong paragraph structure and including supporting sentences, among other skills. So essentially there we've quoted the standard, right? That's what a 6th grade student needs to be able to do for ELA, okay? So on an in-class summative writing assessment, so I've named the assessment, taken on November 13th, 2015, Johnny scored 1s and 2s on a scoring rubric on paragraph structure and supporting sentences. Mastery is 3 or 4. Johnny is able to form complete sentences with correct subject-verb agreement and appropriate end marks. Okay, so now I have an idea of what he can do. Due to Johnny's disability, he struggles with written expression. Johnny is not currently able to organize sentences that build on one another for the completion of an idea. I know what he can't do within that realm. In order for Johnny to meet that standard, he needs to be able to write a complete paragraph with topic sentence and at least 3 supporting sentences. Johnny's weakness in applying organizational strategies, and sorry, that meant to say in writing, such as forming an argument and supporting with clear reasons, affects his progress in completing 6th grade essay assignments. Okay, and that would be across the board. Any given anywhere across the board, that's where we're going to see that into.
Write a PLAF. How to write a good PLAF. None of us will ever do.
Okay, I think I have here somebody. Is that okay? How does that feel to everyone based on the 5 key things we chatted about?
So my question is, I've seen class less than narrative and more like really bare bones, all of those pieces, but less of a
Narrative.
So
Karen, I don't know if you can hear that, but Maggie is saying she's class written with all of these points, but in less of a less narrative and more like bullet points, but kind of covering the same information. I think she's asking if that's appropriate.
Not bullet points, but
Not
much
so
less verbiage, right? There's a lot less, and I wonder if that's appropriate or not.
So it could be. If I, in this piece, this is a pretty high functioning student, right? Functioning standard, and getting pretty specific in there. You know, with our more functional academic students, less may be required. But if you're hitting those 5 pieces and you've addressed them and it comes out shorter, then fantastic. That's better.
A lot of our students have a very wide gap between what they are able to do and what they need to accomplish. And so we end up with a really lengthy class. I mean, we're talking many paragraphs, like we're talking a lot of writing. And so my question is, what is appropriate to make sure that we've covered everything that they can and cannot do without writing pages that no one will actually read? it's more, I think, related to the goals. It's like, okay, you just focus on the areas that you're doing the goals for, kind of justify where you're doing the goals.
Yeah, we don't have to so the very first line is the standard, so we're kind of relating the student to the standard. We don't need to lay out everything on, this is the child in words.
Word vomit.
Yeah. Word vomit, we're not vomiting.
I've read classes that are literally everything the child can do.
So I would push back on that and say that's not necessarily standard-based IEP then. If you've got a PLAF that says everything a child can and cannot do, there's no way we're addressing all of that through an IEP, right? Okay. We're pushing back and we're saying, hey, here's where we would like, here's where the standard is, and we're going to teach towards those standards. So if I've got all of this, he can't make his bed, he can't do this, he can't do that, that may not be things that we're going to address educationally in this year for this child. So I'm with you though. I have seen those PLAFs where maybe it's been a Battelle or a Brigance, and they've looked at every skill developmentally across that age range, and they have listed out the yays and nays on everything. And I just don't feel like the law requires us to do that with a standard-based IEP.
Okay.
The law says, find the standards, figure out where the child is in reference to the standard, and let's start closing the gap between where the child is and where the standard is.
And Karen, I think you made a good point at the beginning too, when you were talking about the key skills that the children need to be able to close some of those gaps. I don't know what you do with yours. I have found myself at times maybe listing a couple of things that are clearly weaknesses that other people would look at and say, why are these not targeted in this IEP? And saying, you know, because of this X, Y, and Z, this is a priority goal for this time or whatever. And that these other things will be addressed once this is achieved, or however that is, just to acknowledge that we recognize this is a complicated student and this is not all there is to work on.
Yes, that's right. And I think we're coming back to, we're an educational based agency as well, right? Our goal is that piece. And sometimes, and I've had it, you know, with parents well-meaning who bring all these other pieces to the table that they want their child to do. And that's fabulous, but it all comes back down to, here's the standards for the grade level. Everything we do is geared towards moving them towards those standards. So is that kind of summing up what I'm hearing you say?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I want to throw a quick non-example in here of a PLAF. Rosie has improved in her writing since last year. She uses the computer as an accommodation to compose longer writing pieces. She uses the argument graphic organizer when forming her thoughts for assignments. Spelling is still an issue. So take a look at this. Which of those 5 pieces are in that PLAF or are not in that PLAF?
There's no standard.
No standard.
Perfect.
Her can statement is too vague.
Right.
She's improved since last year, but that gives us no data, right?
And what is
And,
spelling is
yeah,
an
what
issue.
issues does she still have with spelling?
So it says can, but we don't know what we need more
There's
specific.
no
And
impact
how is the computer an accommodation? How is it used as an accommodation?
Right. And
Yeah.
So we're missing everything.
okay, excellent. So this really doesn't give us a jumping block or a diving board into what we should be teaching her, right? There's nothing explicit here that says, well, she can do this, but she can't do this. And we know she's got to get over here. So what's the next thing we need to teach in order to close the gap between where she is and where she needs to be? So, and I love the spelling is still an issue. It's like, well, if I were to pick that up and have to write a goal off that, I would not be able to write a goal off that data. So, okay, so here's a quick rubric I'm going to send you when writing that PLAF of the, oh, sorry, that's the goal one. It's in the wrong spot. Never mind, backwards with that. Okay, so with that PLAF, Adam, I had asked Adam to have you all bring some baseline data on students and maybe even on one that you have an IEP coming up on so we can kind of get a jump start on that. If you'll pull out the data you've got and let's use it to write a PLAF.
I'll run to the car. But it's standardized.
Oh, so we have some teachers that have brought it, but it's standardized. Some of it's standardized. So teachers are going to go to their classes and grab some.
Okay, well, let's take a look at that standardized. Let's just for fun poke holes in the theory that maybe standardized testing will not give us the key components of a PLAF. So what was the standardized testing that somebody has?
So we're using the Woodcock reading.
I love it. It's my favorite, Woodcock-Johnson reading. Okay.
Okay, what do you want?
Word identification, word comprehension, passage comprehension. What do you want to?
Okay, so let's look at those are our sub-test scores, right?
Uh-huh.
So throw out the reading comprehension score.
I only have the W scores and raw scores. There's no. No, they only do W scores. Does that help you?
Well, the raw scores means it hasn't been converted yet. Okay, throw out the W score.
I've got grade equivalent, age equivalents.
Okay, good. Let's do grade equivalent.
Okay, 1.6.
Okay. So how old is the student? What grade is the student?
12th grade.
12th grade. Okay. Let's go with the 12th grade ELA standard is reading with enough fluency to comprehend text at the 12th grade level. I totally made that up, but it very well possibly could be close to a standard. Let's say that's the standard, okay? Now we're going to put in there what they can do. And I write in, according to the Woodcock-Johnson reading assessment given on September 15th, 2018, Johnny scored a grade equivalent of 1.5. Did I get that right?
1.6, yeah.
Okay, 1.6. We don't want to cheat him. 1.6. Okay. Now what?
His strengths.
So that's where we get stuck, right? What can he do?
That's right. He's a nice boy.
Good.
Friends. He floss as well.
He thought, yeah.
Okay. Has a charming smile. He lightens the classroom. Okay. So that's where we get stuck, right? What does 1.6 mean he can do?
Okay, so can maybe sound out some words.
Okay.
Identify some sight words.
Yeah. Yeah. So this boy came from another country and is really doing well because his vocabulary is great. He's got a lot, but it's all really low. So, but he had to learn it all, and they're all sight words. So,
Okay, so what would be a way to measure what he knows? Because you're saying he knows a lot, he's learned quickly. What would be a way to measure what he knows and what he can do at this moment in time?
so could I say he does, or he scores well on weekly vocabulary tests at his level, or no? Is that too vague? Or I could use the percentages of his vocabulary tests, or not.
What do we think?
You do like informal observations about. Did you hear what I said about the vocabulary tests?
No, one more time.
So he really does well on his vocabulary tests. The weekly vocabulary tests we do.
Okay. And what vocabulary is that? Is that grade level vocabulary? Is that
From his reading, from his on-level reading.
okay? And his on-level reading is what?
Not his on-level, but level that he is on.
Yep. And what is that?
1.6.
And is that according to the Woodcock-Johnson reading? So what's that according to? So you kind of see the quandary we're in, right? So what if you were to give him a first grade reading passage and have him read it, look for accuracy, look for fluency, and report that out? Because the subtests that the reading mass, the Woodcock-Johnson reading, those tests are comprised of multiple skills to get that overall score, even on the subtest, right? So we don't know if he's scoring high in one skill and low in another that is generalized out to that 1.6. We don't know what he really can do and what he can't do.
So I have a question about it. You mentioned multiple skills. We read the multi-skill series, and that, gives us inference. Can he inference? It has those skills, so I could use those possibly to say he does well on inference questions, or he does well on comprehension questions when reading at this level, or
Okay, so multiple skills is a comprehension practice curriculum, right? So what you could pull from that, when given a curriculum-based assessment of reading passages at the first grade level, if that's what if the multiple skills leveled reader is, he reads this many words per minute with this % accuracy and is able to answer 2 out of 3 comprehension questions related to inference, 2 out of 3 related to fact recall, and 3 out of 3 related to yada yada, right? Because in multiple skills, they group the questions they're asking into different areas of comprehension.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That would be a way I could use that. So that would potentially be
Right, then I know what he can do. I know he can read somewhat fluently at a first grade level. I know that he's comprehending on the different levels, inference, fact recall, emotion, all of those things at that level. And now I know, okay, well, we feel pretty good about his comprehension reading at a first grade. Now we got to move that reading grade level up. And so now we've got our needs too, because we've got to close the gap between his first grade reading level and 12th grade text reading level. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if comprehension scores were low, like he's getting 0 out of 3 correct on fact recall comprehension questions, now that also identifies, well, he can read it, but he can't comprehend it. So where am I going to go now? I'm going to work on comprehension, right?
Yes.
Give me an amen, people.
Amen.
All right. Does
Hallelujah.
that make sense? But that 1.6, my point would just be that 1.6 off the Woodcock-Johnson does not tell you whether it's a specific comprehension of fact, recall, inference, if it's an accuracy, a fluency issue, if he's making mistakes in his reading and just making up words. Like, all of those curriculum-based assessments really give us more of a drill down piece of its phonics, its word recall, its sight words, any of that piece. So another piece I would say when you're saying your sight words is, when given 10 sight words in a 5-day instructional period, he is able to read all 10 by the end of 5 days for however many times you've taken data on that.
I'm participating in a webinar tomorrow on how to appropriately diagnose reading levels. So
Perfect.
I'll do
Great.
after that.
That would be great. Okay. All right. Good discussion. Are there any more questions related to that?
Yes. When IEPs go between teachers and service providers, if we have folks who don't know what our curriculum-based assessment was, how are they supposed to understand what it means? Because, if we put data from a Woodcock-Johnson, all of us are very familiar with what it means when you get a score off of a standardized test.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that Nancy uses multiple skills for reading fluency and I use something completely different. How are we supposed to know when we transfer students what in the world she's talking about. She's made a goal based off of the level of comprehension of the student, but how are we supposed to take that information and then meet the student at the same place and continue to make progress based off of that piece of paper?
Okay, so if she writes in the PLAF that the child, their need is to work on comprehension, and here's the data that shows they can't do the comprehension because 0 out of 3 comprehensions back to recall, or 0 out of inferring, inference type questions. All curriculum-based assessments give you the outcome, but you don't have to know what the curriculum-based test was to do that, because reading is leveled, right? If I know a child's reading at a first grade level at 50 words per minute, I know based on norms that a child should be reading at 80 words per minute in order to be considered fluent and for me to bump him to second grade. So whatever assessment she did that gave me the information that they're at first grade at 50 words per minute really doesn't matter. She could be using dibbles, she could be using pathways, she could be using whatever. The end result is the data that came out of it that tells me exactly what the child can and can't do.
I'm going to be naming that skill. So I have a student right now that on multiple skills specifically misses every number 4. And number 4 is inferencing. So I know I need to work on inferencing with that student. So
I think another way to address that question too is that it gets caught up in the goal. So that statement, that can statement where that data comes from, that is just telling us where we got that data, that is saying how far that child is or is not, and then the goal is written hopefully to enable us to move forward in what that intervention actually looks like and what we're trying to achieve, not necessarily on that particular assessment. In fact, that's been part of my instruction is you don't ever say we'll achieve a 2.6 on the Woodcock-Johnson, reading subtest in your goal, because then you are confined to that. But more write your goal so well that someone can go in and see what exactly you're measuring.
Right, and how would I progress monitor my progress towards achieving a 2.6 on the Woodcock-Johnson?
you would.
You can't, right? You just can't. And the Woodcock-Johnson was never meant to be a progress monitoring tool. It's not sensitive enough to pick up that a child is on trajectory to meeting a certain goal. It is a standardized test to give a norm referenced picture of where a child is relative to other kids that mostly is used for eligibility. So it doesn't mean we can't pull some programming information off of it. We can, but it's not the end all be all of delineating what a child can and cannot do that will help us say, so now they can't do this specific skill. All that says is I know they can't read on grade level, but I don't know what the skill is I have to remedy to get their reading up. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because the goal is going to be, what do I need to do? What's the remedy to get this reading up? So let's jump there. Rubric. Now, Adam mentioned a IEP goal format you're already doing. So I put a few in here that whatever you choose to use is great. But this comes back to kind of what you were saying before of some kids have so many cans and can'ts and so many can'ts for a lot of our kiddos that we need to determine what's the priority need, right? So we're going to select the need with the greatest impact on the progress towards the standard, okay? And we're going to develop a goal to address that need. So here's one template to writing the goal. It's the 1, 2, 3. I think you guys use the state forms for your IEP, so I pulled that off this to try and align on the state form. But number 1, what's the condition under which the child will do the skill we're going to ask him to do? So given a first grade reading passage, or when in social skills group, or when asked to define, those are the kinds of conditions we're going to put in there. Okay, then we're going to write the observable social or academic behavior. What is it the student is going to do? Okay, and then the criteria. How well will they do it? How fast will they do it? What the mastery is. Okay, so here's a template. Given this condition, Johnny will do this, and we will demonstrate mastery by, and that's where we're going to stick in that piece. Now, one of the things I want to share with you before we go any further on this is I think it's always helpful to think about the criteria when writing the goal and almost putting that forward. How am I going to measure this? What will the data sheet look like if I write the criteria for mastery like this? One of the things I've seen is that a lot of behavior goals where it will say Johnny will follow directions first time given for 80% of all opportunities. And when I see that goal, I understand the intent behind it, but what that means is I always say to the teacher, so you're going to follow this child around all day long and tally up how many opportunities they get through the day, and then you're going to tally how many opportunities they actually did it, and then create your data from that. Is that feasible for you to be able to take data that way? And it's not, right? Nobody has the time or the manpower to do that. So what's a different way to write it? Maybe it's in during a 15-minute interval of observation, Johnny will raise his hand, when asked to, when he wants to participate. And then I've taken that criteria down to a very doable, reasonable way to measure the progress on that goal. Does that make sense?
Can I just interject here? Because that example, I know we're just pulling examples out of our head, but I've seen that like a specific goal written just like that on some IEPs. And my issue with that type of statement is you have to know that they wanted to participate or that they wanted to answer the question in order to say that they will raise their hand when they want to participate or when given an opportunity to participate. Does that make sense?
Yes, and usually that goal is written in response to a maladaptive behavior like talk outs, right? Like shout outs. So I've got a child who's shouting out 15 times every 30 minutes in the gen ed classroom, but he needs to be able to raise his hand and wait till he's called on. And so then, therefore, my goal will be during a 15-minute observation, Johnny will raise his hand and wait to be called on when wanting to participate.
So would you include that you're trying to negate the shout out behavior?
Well, that would be my PLAF.
Okay. But then I
would say we'll wait to be called on.
Right. So I guess my question here is that, we have aides in our classroom, right? And if I just hand this goal to my aide and she says, well, all right, every time he raises his hand, I'll give him a check mark. But he'll have a really low amount of check marks one day because I didn't feel like participating. So that's going to skew your data based on what your aide knows to do, or based on what somebody else knows to do with what you've written. So why wouldn't your goal be so specific as to say when participate, or like when, I just hate that the goal isn't as specific to tell you exactly what you're doing and how you're getting that data.
Okay, so remember we're just talking about the criteria piece here, that we're thinking ahead of how am I going to take data on this. That's feasible, right?
Yeah. So in the outreach, I've seen this, and as a teacher myself, I would go into a school, I would work off of a teacher's IEP goal, and almost 100% of them were written 80% of all opportunities, or with 80% accuracy, or so what you're saying, it makes sense. I'm getting this from a teacher's perspective. I think if I'm going to work off a goal that somebody else has written and try to support that goal, I need to understand where that's coming from, and 80% of all opportunities isn't a great way to do that. So
what's an opportunity?
So what's an opportunity? So I think what Karen's trying to say is we need to look at what we can actually measure, what is specifically, what are we looking for, and what is the criteria, the avenue, the time frame that we're going to put that in.
Right. So let me just stick, if I can, let me follow that piece through. So that's the word about criteria. We're thinking about how am I going to measure this? What does the data sheet look like before I go ahead and write something in the goal that once that's in there on the goal and on the IEP, and now I'm like, how am I going to do that? Right? Because that's exactly that scenario Adam's talking about. I write 80% of all opportunities, and it's like, okay, well, I have just forced myself to be Velcro to this child when I'm taking data for the whole time to figure out how many opportunities and then how many were taken, okay? So if we go back here and we look at the condition, the observable behavior and the criteria, when given open response assignments or tasks, which require explanation, citation, or reading in the response, reasoning in the response, that's the criteria, right? The condition. When that piece happens, now I want to see the child do this. I want to see him write a complete paragraph with topic sentence and at least 3 supporting sentences in classroom summative assessments in 3 out of 4 trials, scoring a minimum of 3 on a rubric over the period of the IEP year. Okay, so I've got in there the condition under which it will happen, what he will do, very observable, right, very measurable, and how I'm going to know he did that, how I'm going to know he mastered it, because he did it out of 3 out of 4 trials with a 3 on a rubric, which is a writing rubric, which I can share with you guys if you want to do that too, right? Here's another way. When given a letter A through Z verbally, so that's the condition or the when, John will independently, and I always add a how in there for our more functional students. If there's any question about whether we're asking the child to do it independently or with a physical prompt or with a verbal prompt or with a partial physical prompt, that's going to go in there. We'll write the letter legibly and correctly within 5 seconds over 3 data probes. Okay?
So then you would
time him for how fast he's giving you the answer. And
you would take the child and work with him on 3 probes,
right.
and then you would time him.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
all right.
Now here's why I put 5 seconds on this particular child's goal. Because when I say write B, and they sit there and look at me for 7 seconds, 8 seconds, guess what I know about that child?
Well, and it's no longer independent because you will automatically prompt. Like that's the next step. You have to.
Well, I know that child has not have any kind of mastery, because if he can't produce it in under 5 seconds and he has to think that long and that hard, right? We're not there yet.
Well, right. So Karen, I have a question for you.
Uh-huh.
Can we email you the next IEP we have?
Of course. And like I say, this is, you know, this is not, I want you to think of this as a rational, kind of logical piece of, you made a good point of, if my staff assistant picks up that goal right there and it says, when given a letter A to Z verbally, okay, that means I need to tell the child, write A, B, C, whatever, that I'm not going to give him any help because he's got to do it independently, and I'm going to see him write the letter. And only if he does that within 5 seconds am I going to consider that a check mark. Does that make sense?
yes.
Okay. All right. So based on the PLAF piece you did before, okay, so let's take it through. What goal would you write as a reading goal for that student?
I'm sorry, Karen, I was trying to interject something. Could you restate your question?
Restate which one, Adam?
No, restate what you just asked. I'm sorry. I think we got caught up in the technology.
Oh, no, you're fine. So if we were to take a PLAF, let's go back to our PLAF up here, okay? What would be the goal that we would write, and how would we write it?
You just wrote that goal.
Class.
About the topic sentence and the supporting sentences. I think the one you wrote was wonderful.
Oh, that's a cop-out.
It's accurate.
Okay. All right. So on a kiddo, on your next IEP, just for fun, identify a need that you will write a goal regarding.
Oh, Sorry, can you restate that? We're
Okay, think about a child you have that has an upcoming IEP. What is a need that you'll write a goal for?
Subject verb agreement.
Perfect. All right, let's do it. Let's write it.
okay.
So
Condition.
speaking, subject verb, like, are we writing? Writing? Okay.
Given 10 sentences.
When asked to write 5 sentences using subject verb agreement.
When asked to write 5 sentences using subject verb agreement. This is from Maggie, not or Warren. Sorry. Johnny.
Well, right. Johnny will write.
Appropriate.
Well, I would say,
subject
well,
verb agreement.
I would say 3 out of 5. Something wrong with
Johnny will write 3 out of 5.
Johnny will
No,
write 3
Johnny
out of
will write
5
appropriately.
sentences
with appropriate
right,
subject verb
sentences
agreement.
using
3 out of 5.
well, and then so here's my question, because I would go for a benchmark with that sucker. I'd say using, including a subject, period. And then I do a subject and a verb, period. You know, like, would you include benchmarks?
Okay, so we're going to get to benchmarks in just a second. So an overall goal, when given a topic to write a sentence on, Johnny will write a sentence with, this is what I think I'm hearing, correct noun verb agreement. Am I right so far?
Yes, you got us.
Okay. For 3 out of 4 probes. Independently?
With 1 prompt.
With what kind of prompt?
1 verbal prompt.
Independently.
Verbal prompt.
We've got 2 different levels of teachers here.
Okay, you totally can battle that out. Here's the thing I would think is, what's the verbal prompt you're going to give?
That's my question.
What's the verbal
The
prompt?
verbal, I would say with 1.
And
Okay,
say,
so
is
I can
this
see
one
where that
person?
would get.
Multiple choice prompt.
Right.
That's the problem. So talking about plurals.
Right, so
It
it's
is
hard,
an R.
right. So I guess that would be hard to write, but it's something that we do.
Right, that would be my question is, if you're verbal prompting, are you telling him he got it wrong and he needs to change it?
Or are you saying,
Right.
look
That's
at
what you're
your.
doing.
That's what I'm asking.
That's exactly what you're doing.
Right.
Right. So I see that as, yeah, I don't know about that, but
Wouldn't that be based on need? You know, if you have a student that you know, based on their class, messes up plurals and singular, you would say, is it 1 person or 2 people? You would say is or are, because that's 1 prompt. Offer them an option so that they think about their choice.
And so I would typically list maybe an example or 2 if I was going to give them different types of sentences to write. I mean, for example, as you were bringing up this as a goal, I'm thinking, how would I be measuring this? So probably what I would be doing for my quote activity to take the on aside from the instruction time would be maybe like, I have 10 pictures here. Pick one and write a sentence about what's happening in that picture. And my prompts might be something like, well, do you see a boy or a girl? Do you see 1 cat or 2 cats? You know, what are they doing? Something like that might be the prompts I would get if I felt like that child was going to leave out some of that information or needed some more guidance on paying attention and tuning into that subject or that verb piece.
Or would you just always go independently and just see what they produce when you're doing a data probe, and then you teach it later by using those prompts?
And you can, because if you want to get them independently, then that's a benchmark you would go through.
Right, but then you'd have to write a benchmark.
But if you're not sure they're going to get there independently,
All right.
then you need to have a.
so let me jump in at this point.
Maggie will stop talking for just a minute. We have about 10 minutes before we have to end this. Our
Yeah, well, we can do this in 5. So
Okay.
here's what I would throw back on that. Now remember, instruction is different than taking data on the go, right? So if I in instruction, I'm going to give that pre-prompt. Remember, when we write sentences, we always look for, If there's one or more people, that's great, okay? And then the other piece I would offer is if I have to constantly be giving prompts, am I not teaching on the instructional level? But that's something, but I like the way you're thinking, right? Because you're really thinking, gosh, what would that prompt be? I just wrote in the goal that I would give a prompt, but what would that prompt be? And does that prompt negate the fact that I'm trying to measure if he can do this skill or not? So let's go down to the benchmarks piece. So if you have a child who's on the DLM or UA, you're required to do 2 benchmarks or short-term objectives, okay? The goal will still be the goal. Underneath, I'm gonna write benchmarks. Benchmarks are usually time-related. So by November, the child will write 3 sentences with verb-noun agreement with a verbal prompt. But the goal will be eventually to do it independently, right? Short-term objectives are stepping stones. I take the overall goal and I break it down into discrete parts that I basically am chaining, right? So if the goal is to write verb and noun agreement, what sub-skills or foundational skills does that child need to learn in order to get there? And that's what I'm going to outline in stepping stones in my short-term objectives. That's the difference between the two. Okay. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be timed.
Does it have to be timed?
Benchmarks, that's the definition of benchmarks, is that we're saying she'll be do this much by this time, then she'll be this further along to the goal by this time, and this further along to the goal by this time. Short-term objectives are discrete parts of the skill that we're breaking down.
Okay, Karen, so when I was in the post-high program, and we were working on independent skills, we would often get files for students from other schools that would say, Johnny will improve his independent living skills by doing the following by the end of such and such a school year. And then they would use the benchmark area to list off skills that they needed to learn or things that they would do. Is that appropriate or is that not appropriate?
So I'm gonna reserve judgment on that because my personal opinion is I would not write that way. And the reason why is because if I have a goal that's super global, like improve daily living skills, and then I've got benchmarks of 4 things by washing hands, toileting, folding towels, yada, yada. How do I know that I've accomplished that goal if I've done 3 of the benchmark? I mean, it's too crazy global. I would bring it down. Now, the other piece I would add in there is we have essential elements for kids that are DLM or UA that are the standards. And so those would be the standards you would reference in the PLAF and then write goals towards.
Question though, like our IEP format doesn't have stepping stones. They just have benchmarks.
Well, that's what the benchmarks are stepping stones. So that's where we would use those in. Yeah.
Yeah, so if the child's on a DLM, you'll have the goal, and then underneath you should have the ability to write 2 either benchmarks or short-term objectives. So, okay, all right. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 is I got this. 1 is help me now. Where do you feel like you're at?
1, but I think that's because it's the end of the day. 5 tomorrow, maybe.
Okay. All right. So yes, feel free to send me drafts and say, I think this is where I'm going. I've got my can, my can't, the rest. And I'm happy to give feedback. I know this is a big switch. I know for our teachers, it took us a little bit to get there. But once we're there, I think it helps align everything from data-based can and can't do's to now what is the need, how does it all align to the standard, and now what am I going to teach so that I can fulfill that need.